I'm Jackie Lockie, your financial planning maestro. This series of podcasts is aimed at financial planning professionals and also those who are looking to enter the financial planning profession. We will be talking during the podcast about all things Certified Financial Planner certification related, talking to other CFPs around the world, and also we will be dropping in on some new entrants who've just entered the financial planning profession, and we'll be checking up along the way on a regular basis with them to see how they're getting on. I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie Lockie, your financial planning maestro. And today is a special extra podcast episode, and I'm talking again to my other half, or my better half, Robert Lockie from Bloomsbury Wealth. Hello, Robert.
Hello.
Now, we have been talking off air, or I've been grappling with a particular issue that keeps popping up in explanations in financial reports and financial plans that I've been seeing for the Level 7 CISI case study assessment. And I thought, actually, it's to do with assumptions and the knock-on effect and impact of assumptions. And so being the king of assumptions, widely known across the profession, I thought that you're the best person to chat to about this area.
Well, that's decent of you to say so.
So we are going to talk all about the impact of this phrase that I see in written reports, and that is that the financial planner is going to err on the side of caution. So essentially, what does that mean? Rounding down investment returns, all sorts of different things to make the numbers slightly more cautious. And I think a lot of people do that. In fact, I'm not quite sure why a lot of people do that, but there's this urge to make sure that clients don't run out of money, I think, isn't there?
I think that's probably a reasonable reason for why people may do that, because it's obviously worse to run out of money before you run out of life than the other way around. And I think people are quite keen to avoid that, and therefore there's a natural tendency to say, well, if you could be more cautious, then that reduces the chances that you'll run out of resources before you die.
So I wanted to chat through the impact of saying something like that and doing something like that, essentially rounding down in different areas and I wanted to talk to you about some very specific assumptions that I don't know whether people actually can really understand the impact of the impact on the plan and therefore on the clients by erring on the side of caution. So when we set assumptions, how do we know if our assumptions are going to be right?
Hopefully it's reasonably obvious that ex ante we don't know that they're going to be right. We can only ever tell after the event, and then it's a matter of over what period you want to consider them, your assessment of whether they're going to be right or wrong. So it's very different to say whether your assumptions are correct over a period of, say, 20 or 30 years to whether they're correct over a period of 1 year. It's obviously much easier to be correct over a longer period because the variation between the return on an asset or measure inflation over 20 years doesn't tend to change a great deal from 1 year to if you look at the rolling 20-year return, it doesn't change a lot from 1 year to the next because obviously most of those years are common to both periods. Whereas the return over 1 year can vary a huge amount between 1 year and the next because there's a lot of randomness involved in all of that.
Yeah.
So it kind of depends on. First of all, you won't know that they will be right because we don't know the future. But you can tell whether they were right only if you look into the past, and obviously that is something that's, you could make an assumption 20 years ago, look back after 20 years and say, great, that was correct, but really, so what? Because while you may have managed to get one assumption correct, it's pretty unlikely you will have got all of them correct. And even if you did get all of your assumptions correct, the client's circumstances will have changed over that time. Their objectives will have changed. Maybe their family circumstances will have changed. And you'd have to get an awful lot right in order to be correct. And if you did, then it would probably be down to luck far more than judgment.
Yeah.
So trying to be right, I think, is a flawed approach.
Yes. So, the one thing that is certain is that we're probably not going to be right, actually, isn't it?
Well, pretty well, yes. There's, if you look at the Bank of England, for example, is one that I like to cite when considering how easy or difficult it is to make assumptions correctly about the future. The Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee has one of its targets as controlling inflation. So in order to do that, obviously, it has to make an assumption about what inflation is going to be. And they look forward something like 36 months. So not a huge amount of time. And they predict what inflation is going to be. And the Bank of England has a lot of very smart people, far smarter than me, people with economics doctorates and all kinds of stuff. And they come up with their assumption about what inflation is going to be, and then they adjust monetary policy accordingly. And a few years ago, some academics did a study of how accurately the Bank of England had managed to do this. And they plotted a line for what their kind of central assumption was, and then they had degrees of confidence either side of it. And unsurprisingly, like all of these charts, it kind of looks like a fan. And then they plotted what the actual inflation was over the period, and they were just about within the 90% range, as I recall. So they were within they were nowhere near the actual central case, but they were kind of quite a long way outside it, but just within the outer limit of their confidences. So I think that illustrates when they're just trying to predict one measure over a relatively short period of time with very smart people, and no doubt very good tools. And I think it just illustrates how difficult this is to do. Yeah.
And I guess this is the advantage of having regular reviews with a client about assumptions, not just about assumptions, but about their entire situation, their objectives, and anything that might have changed. But particularly in relation to the assumptions, then reviews can be really important. I always remember you saying that story about, imagine that a person's trying to achieve their objective and they are walking up a hill, walking the dog, and the dog's on a long lead, and the dog's just waffling around all over the place, up and down, crossing the path. But the individual trying to achieve their objectives and that return is walking the straight path in an upward direction.
Yes, follow the man, not the dog.
Yes, follow the man, not the dog. Yeah.
Yeah. It's similarly with the concept of the drunk walking down Wall Street, lurching from lamppost to lamppost, so it's very difficult in the short term to tell what the long term trend is. You need to look at quite a lot of data points to give you any kind of reasonable clue. But as I said earlier, even if you get all of your assumptions about the economic stuff correct, the client will show up and say, oh, by the way, I'm getting married, I'm getting divorced, I'm having another child, I'm moving to Sweden, any number of possibilities that you weren't expecting, and possibly that they weren't expecting when they started on their plan.
Yes, yeah. And that's actually, sometimes it's the power of financial planning that opens their eyes to things that they could achieve, couldn't it?
Well, indeed. We've certainly had instances where people have come to us with some set of plans, and then something happens, and they say, "Could I do this?" And you have a look at it and say, "Well, yes, it looks as though you could," or well, maybe not yet, or maybe you could if you did that. And they go, "Oh wow, I never even thought that was possible." So yes, it's the fact that it gives you a framework. It's kind of like financial planning generally, really. If you've got a lot of complicated moving parts, then it's very difficult to sit there looking at a pile of numbers on a page and trying to figure out whether you can stop work next week or whether you're committed to another 10 years. It's a lot easier if you can say, well, okay, let's try to put that into some kind of picture that you can relate to, and say, well, okay, if you spent a bit less, you wouldn't have to work again ever.
Yeah.
If this and this and this happened, which they probably won't, but it gives you a framework rather than, well, I have no idea, just keep working because you'll probably be all right.
Yes, until you keel over.
Hope for the best or whatever.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's talk about some specifics where relating to this erring on the side of caution, and we're going to talk about some specific assumptions that is common that most financial planners make when they're building comprehensive financial plans for their clients. So the first one I wanted to talk to you about is longevity. And I always have these difficulties with longevity, and I think partly driven by popular software, financial planning, cash flow software, that most people seem to jump ahead and just assume, irrespective of the client's state of health, that they're going to last to 100. Where in reality, tell me about the ONS stats and why, how that is an average and who would live longer than that.
Well, the ONS stats are a useful starting point, I think. But what they tell you is for a population, and it's based on people who've already been born. So it's not just a kind of random population; it's actual people who actually exist, and it's based on a lot of years worth of data. But it's saying for a population, if you reach a particular age, how long you are on average likely to live, and there are different cohorts for males and females, and I think there's also, I seem to remember there was also one for people who were sort of on average wealthier than or who are wealthier than the average. Because they tend to be they tend to live longer because they have better healthcare and so on. There is a set of data for a population, which is useful if you're involved in the mortality business. So if you're dealing with a population of people applying for life insurance or people applying for annuities, the opposite end of that transaction, then it's useful to have an idea when you're pricing your products where those prices should be. But when you're dealing with an individual, as we are, as planners tend to be, then that it's a starting point, but it doesn't necessarily give you the answer. And I think probably the reason, well, I can't speak for why other people choose to do things, because I'm not privileged to those conversations that they have, the process they follow. But I know how the way that we came up with our figure was, we actually decided that we'd go with 100. So it's a legitimate criticism to say, well, that's a bit finger in the air, and I don't disagree with that. But as I said earlier, we tell our clients that we'll be that these assumptions would be wrong. And I remember somebody telling me a long time ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, saying that you should use 120 because there are people who are alive today who will live to 120. I don't know whether that's true. I do know that the number of people who live to 120 so far of the published data is 0. When people who live to 115 and 116 and that kind of thing, when they crop up, they're in the news. So I kind of guess they're not that common.
No. Yeah.
And therefore, the chances of your client being that guy who lives to 115, I'm happy to say that's not probably hugely likely. And when we say to people, we use a life expectancy of 100, they, more often than not, they tend to say, there's no way I'll live that long, rather than, I think that's too cautious. I think I'll live to, at least 110 because all of my relatives have lived to 110.
Yeah. But I think one of the issues that people have with the level 7 case study and the assessment of that is setting the background of why they've used whatever age they've used for the longevity. And in some of the case studies I am familiar with, there are a couple of clients who are in deteriorating health and blindly just plumping for 100 without thinking through, we always talk about, don't we, the 3 steps to setting assumptions, that you look back as far as you can, you say where you are today, and then you say, actually, your plan is going to be looking forward for 20, 30, 40, however many years it might be, initially, then you adjust accordingly. But as far as longevity goes, if you've got somebody in poor health, then, and say, they're a smoker, maybe they've had a heart attack, maybe they're in poor health as well at the moment, then surely that's not right, just plumping for 100.
Well, yes, I think if there are factors present which are known to have an impact on life expectancy, I think it's reasonable to take some account of that. So similarly, if we ask people if their grandparents are still alive, how old they are, we don't. If someone's in their 70s, we don't tend to ask if their grandparents are still alive. But generally, we'll ask about their parents and their grandparents, and if they've all lived to 90 plus, then that's certainly a factor that might lead us to extend it a bit. And similarly, yes, if they smoke, if they've had a heart attack at 40, and they're wheezing when they come through the door and coughing up blood in the meeting room, then yeah, we might tend to sort of scale back a little bit their assumption for their life expectancy. And sometimes we'll come across clients who actually say that they have been given a reduced life expectancy.
Yes.
So I think it's irresponsible not to consider that. But then it may be that only one of if it's a couple, only one of them has the reduced life expectancy. So the other one, you still have to take account of how long they're likely to live.
Yes.
Because realistically, that's how long the resources are going to have to last.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next area. And there's kind of 2 areas bound together here that I wanted to talk to you about. And that is rounding down of portfolio growth rates combined with setting an asset allocation. So let's run through a little scenario. Let's say you've got a modest risk investor, and for the purposes of your CISI level 7 case study, you have determined that modest risk investor would be 50-50 of equity and debt secure investments. And you're given some assumptions by the CISI of pure asset classes, of equities, gilts, and so forth. So you come out with your 50-50, you work out your number, obviously after costs, and you get a percentage. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that it's 2.65% is your asset allocation, your growth rate that you're going to apply to the portfolio to see whether the objectives of that client can be achieved. So what are the downsides of erring on the side of caution in that scenario?
Well, I guess first of all, the thing which kind of jumps out at me first on that one is the fact that, this is completely alien to me because when I did my exams, you didn't have a set of assumptions given to you. So if someone has come up with a set of assumptions that they've told you to use for rates of return on various asset classes, you don't know how they've come up with those numbers. You don't know how cautious they were being when they derived them. You don't know what process they followed. You don't know whether it's the same process you would follow. And therefore, when you come to doing this in the real world rather than just in a case study, you're not you can't really say, well, you can, but I would like to defend it in court, that you use the figures provided to you by some professional body for the purposes of an examination, and because they came up with those numbers, you assume that they were correct. Because you really don't know how they came up with them, and frankly, someone else's guess is likely to be just as good or as bad as my guess. But if you have to stand up in court and defend it, or you have to argue it in front of false or whatever, then I'd be a lot more confident of defending my numbers if I knew what process I'd used to come up with them, by what data I'd looked at, and how I'd interpreted that, and how that was how I felt that was reasonable, and how I used that process for every client, and therefore it was at least consistent across all of our clients. And I think you're much more likely with this kind of thing to be dinged for having a bad process than having bad outcome. Because the process is what you can control. You can't control what the market will do, but you can control how reasonably you have behaved in trying to come up with your assumptions.
Yes.
So I think that there is a weakness in the fact that someone's provided you with some numbers and you don't know how cautious they are. But if you assume that those numbers are accurate, in quotation marks,
and it's just a fictitious situation, isn't it?
It's obviously fictitious.
For the case study, you have to assume that they're accurate, but obviously in real life, as you say, you have to find a basis for your own.
Yes. And I don't know, I mean, there's obviously some good reason for it, which I'm not privileged to, but back in the day, you always had to come up with your own assumptions and reason them. And that was always the area on training courses which we spent the most time on, as people struggle to come up with coming up with reasoning and a process for deriving their assumptions. But anyway, so I think if you've been given those numbers and told these are the numbers to use, it kind of seems a bit counterintuitive to me to say, well, these are the numbers we've been given to use for assumptions, but we're basically not going to use them. We're going to use some other numbers, because then, imagine if you'd come up with the numbers and then said, okay, well, we've come up with these by a process that we think is very sound. So you've got to the same point as the ones you've been given, which is, those numbers are, quote, correct. So having come up with those numbers which are, quote, correct, why would you then say, well, we're not going to use those, we're going to use some different numbers? Yeah. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and I think it would be quite hard to defend. So I don't really know why you would do that. It doesn't seem to follow a logic.
I've seen it in plans hundreds of times over. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you have, but that doesn't, you'd need to ask the people who did it rather than
Yeah.
me why they choose to do that,
Yeah.
because I can't see an argument for doing it really.
But the impact of changing the 2.65 example that we were just talking about, and saying, okay, I'm going to err on the side of caution and round it down to 2.5 instead of 2.65. What is that effectively doing to the financial plan that you're creating for that client?
Well, the impact is very easy because you're effectively changing the discount rate, and the effect of that is that in order to get to a particular value of capital at some point in the future, if you're projecting that you're going to achieve a lower return between now and then, you're going to need more money at the beginning.
Yeah.
Now, clearly, if you're not in a position to be able to create more money at the beginning, which most people aren't, they have an amount of resource now, and it's the future value that is variable. Then you have an amount of money now. You reduce the return that you're expecting to achieve on that. The outcome is you have a lower value of money in the future. And the impact of having less money in the future is that it may run out sooner, or you may have to scale back your goals to spend less in order not for it to run out, or a combination of those. Or the other one, which I think is particularly interesting and which kind of follows pretty logically on, but is kind of leads you off in the opposite direction of being cautious, is that if you want to achieve the higher return and therefore get the higher value at the end, you effectively have to take more risk. You have to, because risk and return are related, you have to move up the scale a bit, probably have more exposure to risky assets in order to get that higher expected return. And there's no certainty that you will get that higher expected return because it's an expected return, not an actual return. And risk means that you might not get it. But as a consequence of being cautious in your return assumption, you're effectively, one of the options that you have to get back on track is to take more risk, which most people would consider to be the opposite of being cautious.
Yes. And then if that went to court, I mean, surely you'd be strung up, wouldn't you? Because you're effectively saying you're cautious, but actually you need to take more risk to achieve what you want. Therefore, I'm going to move you up the risk scale.
I think as one of my old colleagues once said, you're rather leading with your chin there.
Yeah.
It's quite an aggressive approach, and if you're up against a reasonably competent barrister, they will say, but this is surely more risk rather than less risk, and you kind of need to be prepared for that question, because if the other guy's barrister is not up to is half decent, that'll definitely be coming your way.
Yes.
And you need to have a good argument for why you did that.
Yeah.
I think.
And also I think one of the other knock-on effects of this situation with reducing growth rates is that, what you just alluded to there, that you are essentially asking clients to put their hand deeper into their pockets from now on in to achieve objectives that they thought that they could just about achieve because you've rounded down these growth rates. And so essentially what you're asking them to do is, not quite pauper themselves, but to have less money on a day-to-day basis. So they might not be able to, go out for dinner as much, or they might not be able to join as many clubs as they wanted to, or do as many sports as they wanted to. These are the unintended consequences, aren't they, of erring on the side of caution?
They are, and those may be choices that they take. because they are things which they can control. There's not a lot which the investor can control, but how much they spend and how much they save and how much risk they take are certainly a couple of the levers that they can pull. And so I think it's not necessarily wrong for them to do that, but they should be doing it in the knowledge that the assumptions on which they're making that are behind the data that are causing them to come to those decisions are reasonable. And if you're going to say, yes, well, we scaled it back a bit because we think that the future will have a lower return, then they can agree with that or disagree with it, and you can say, well, and because of that, it looks like you run out of money 20 years before you're due to die, or before we've assumed you're going to die. Bear in mind that we're going to be wrong about that as well. Then they can look at that and say, I'm comfortable with that. It's a long way off, or I'm expecting to inherit some money, or whatever. But I think it's important that you're giving them your best guess in the knowledge that it'll be wrong, and they must appreciate that you're telling them that it will, in all likelihood, be wrong, so that they can make a decision based on the best data that you have, and then obviously you just keep reviewing it.
Yeah.
And as you get further down the line, the things are likely to, in our experience anyway, they tend to vary much less from year to year. When you've got people in their 70s, the viability of their plan tends to vary much less from year to year compared to if they're in their 40s.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the next bit and talk about the effect of erring on the side of caution when using annuity rates. Because if you are, I know that in our last podcast that we talked about assumptions, I think annuity rates was the one that you were saying that, when we go through our 3 processes and look back as far as you can, say where you are today and say what you're going to be using into the future as you're planning into the future, and they'll be, retiring. And I use the term annuity rates, but I kind of mean in its widest generic term, not a pension annuity, but a facility to strip income out of an asset. So if we take an asset stripping rate in terms of a generic annuity, then if we do that and set a rate and then err on the side of caution and round it down again, then what kind of effect is that having on people as they get to retirement?
Well, I think if it's much the same kind of effect. If you reduce the rate at which you're planning to withdraw from an asset, then it should, all else being equal, the asset should last longer, but you're going to have less cash flow to spend.
Yeah.
So that may be acceptable. I guess it's like old Bengen with his 4% rule, which is, I mean, apart from Brinson Hood and Biebauer, must be the worst misquoted study that's ever been done in personal finance. But if you said, well, instead of 4%, let's use 3%, then you'll get less out every year, but in theory, your portfolio should last longer.
Yes.
The difficulty that I think that we found is a lot of the time when we look at our clients, they don't tend to have withdrawal patterns that look remotely like that, because they've got different bits of cash flow coming in at different points. And some years they have some capital expenditure and other years they won't. So I can't think of anyone who takes out a consistent percentage of their portfolio every year among any of our clients.
Yeah.
And therefore this kind of exercise is I mean, it might work for some people, but I don't find it terribly useful in practical terms for our clients.
Yeah. And I think what concerns me most about this erring on the side of caution is that if you didn't err on the side of caution and the numbers are what the numbers are for all of the assumptions that you're making, and then you erred on the side of caution left, right, and centre, and you compared the two financial plans with an identical starting point, but obviously the assumptions would be different, then that second plan could end up miles away from the first one and give a completely different picture and a completely different emotional response to the clients that you were presenting it to.
I would agree entirely. I remember probably 15 years ago, we had a client. We still work with him, and he had because he described himself as cautious. He had an assumption for his expenditure escalation of 10% a year.
Wow.
And even though he had several million spread across assorted accounts, he ran out of money at about 70, I think, something like that. It was certainly well short of our expected life expectancy for him. And it just goes to show that you make an assumption which is quote cautious, and it can have a massive effect. He's now scaled back his expenditure assumption to something to basically our default, which is and his plan works a lot better than it did then.
Yes.
But yes, if you change. If you change everything, you change all of your assumptions, particularly for people who are young, and therefore you have a lot of compounding going on over a long period of time. If you vary every assumption, even just by a little bit, you'll end up with something that looks completely different. And it might be more accurate. The difficulty is that you can't tell. And who's to say that maybe you shouldn't have rounded them in the other direction?
Well, and that's the other argument. And therefore, if you could, do it both ways, you could have 3 sets of plans. And actually, why don't you just don't err on the side of caution and stick with what the numbers are?
Well, this kind of leads you to, well, okay, so we've got one high, one low, and one middle. Well, why stop there? You could reasonably adopt an approach whereby you say, well, hey, let's run it 1,000 times. And you end up with one of these kind of massive fans, a bit like the Bank of England with their inflation measure, where you're predicting the extent to which someone's resources will last them for their lifetime. And at the top end, you've got, the line is still going up. You can spend all you want and maybe double that and be fine. And at the other end, you're kind of running out of money in a couple of years.
Yes, don't spend anything.
And you show that to a client and they go, right, I kind of know that the future's uncertain and I will probably either run out of money or not run out of money. But I don't really know now what I should do.
No, it's not helpful, is it?
I don't think it's helpful in the sense that it shows them that the future is uncertain, but our clients kind of know that. I think by the time you've managed to get to the point when you're able to hire a financial planner, you probably have some conceptually. You're probably pretty aware that the future varies, and in the beginning of 2020, nobody was really predicting a global pandemic. In January of 2022, no one was predicting that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine. The day after they invaded Ukraine, I don't think anyone was really predicting that the Russians were going to get a kicking, and it would all still be going on a year later. And the Ukraine was still there and still functioning. So the future is really hard to predict, and I think people. Certainly in the last few years, if they've forgotten before, it's people probably now should be more aware that it's it's hard to know what's going to happen, and therefore, the reason that you do planning is not to tell you what is going to happen. It's to give you a framework in which you can project possible things that you might do to see whether they might work, and whether they might, what consequences they might have.
Yes.
And that's really about the best that I think you get out of it.
Yeah.
Because it's the alternative is you just guess wildly and then hope for the best, cross your fingers. It's certainly not, it's not perfect, but then nothing that you project into the future is ever going to be perfect.
No.
And it's just to help you and to give you a basis on which you can make a decision, which is exactly the same. Businesses have management accounts. You look at the management accounts, you look at the data for customers and sales and all that kind of stuff, and you say, okay, I think we should do this, but you never have all the information you need, because some of what you need is stuff that isn't available yet.
Yes.
And you make a decision, and you make the decision based on the best information you have at the time. Sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. So I saw something the other day where there were a number of different financial planners asking what other financial planners use for their assumptions. And why do financial planners ask what other financial planners are using in their financial plan?
Tempted as I am to say, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question and give the standard interrogation response. I think it's probably because humans generally value what I believe is called social proof, which is why when we're thinking of buying something online, we look for reviews of it to see what other people said about it. And if we find 10,000 reviews who all said this was great, then we kind of think, okay, well, that's it's probably good. And if we find 10,000 reviews that say this was terrible, I'd never buy another one, well, we maybe don't bother. And I think we expect that the more people who are doing something, who have chosen a particular number, the more likely that is to be accurate. Maybe we think the more, if we're in line with what everyone else thinks, then at least if we're wrong, we're not going out on a massive limb, and we're not going to be laughed at. And if we have to go to court, we can say, well, yes, okay, we were wrong, but look, everyone else said the same thing.
But surely asking other financial planners what they use without doing your own rigorous research and having an investment committee where you discuss and document how you set your assumptions and how you decide on the numbers that you come up with. Surely doing something that way, even if you then get to a number which might be or might not be relatively similar to what other financial planning firms are doing, surely that's a better way of doing it, because there are plenty of people out there, and we know who we come across, who don't like doing the in-depth analysis for things. So you can get a misconception or a wonky number that is spread around large groups of people because they just assume that somebody else has done the digging and somebody else has done the research on it.
Oh, sure, yeah, yes. I'm not saying that you should do that approach. I'm saying that's my guess to why people ask what other people are doing. I remember going to a conference years ago where someone put up a portfolio, and they said, this was a portfolio we constructed from a number of stocks, and they all follow we've used some rules to construct the portfolio. So it's we've picked the securities according to some specific criteria, and this is how it turned out. And it was, and this is compared to the index, and it was way, way ahead of the index. And everyone thought, wow, that's pretty good. I wonder if I could do that. And then he said, so shall I tell you what the rules were? And the rule was that they were companies whose names began with M. So it had Microsoft in it. and I suspect most of the return came from Microsoft. Now, if you just said I'm going to follow their rule because that's done really well, and I'm going to copy what they did and buy all those companies, then you'd end up with a portfolio that performed very similarly. But it's not necessarily that, the reason that those companies went up in value wasn't necessarily because they began with the letter M.
No.
There may have been other things at play.
And it doesn't mean that they're going to go up by that much in the future.
Well, it absolutely doesn't. No, and nothing said that they were going to go up over the period that your chart is shown. So I think it's pretty aggressive to follow what someone else has done when you don't know why it's done that. I was talking to the other day to one of my colleagues about a product back in the 90s. Yeah, back in the 90s, I think it was. I'll spare their embarrassment by not mentioning their name. But they're a company in London who were big in the tax shelter field, and they came up with a product or a portfolio whereby it had 5 shares in it, and I think they were taken from the FT30 index. And it was something like the ones with the highest price, and then they divided that price by the yield or something, and then whichever 5 came to the top when you sorted them, those were the 5 they bought.
Okay.
Now, they back tested it and it looked brilliant. But they actually said, we don't know why this worked, but hey, it looks like it does. So there must be something in it. And the interesting thing was that the price wasn't the price adjusted for free float or anything like that. It was literally the price. So if a share was £20 rather than £2, then that would affect whether it was in the 5 or in the other 25 of the 30.
Okay.
And the price of a share is literally at the company's discretion. They can, if their shares are priced at £20 and they say we want to have more shares, they just do a 10-for-1 issue, and now all the shares are £2. It's absolutely meaningless. It's a completely notional value, and what you need to know is the market cap of the business, which is the number of shares times the price. And people lapped this up. We had clients who were recommended to buy into it. Fortunately, not by me. But even though the company doing it said we have no idea why this works, which for me was a massive red flag, because if you're promoting this and you don't know why it works, then I'm going to guess that it's probably down to luck.
Yes.
And if you ended up with the same return assumption as somebody else due to luck, then it's possible that next year, when they review theirs, they might luck out on a different number. Whereas if you have a process whereby you say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we do this every year, and it may be the number doesn't change, but we're going to do the same process every year until we think there's some better process that we should follow. And when a better process comes along, we'll adopt that. But if you follow a particular process and you do it every year, and even though the number that comes out at the end may never change, I think you're on much safer ground than copying somebody else where you don't know what the hell they did. You don't know how they got to their number. You don't even know if they're still using their number. They may be using a completely different one. And at the end of the day, you can't call them as a witness to say, I
use their number.
Well, you can, but it might be that when asked where they got their number, they said, we just guessed, really, and actually we don't really use it ourselves. Then I don't think it's not going to end well, is it?
No, technically stuffed, I think.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, it's very. I think it's quite aggressive to use numbers that someone else has come up with, or use any data that someone else has come up with if you don't know how they've done it.
Yes.
At this point, I would actually bung in a plug for Tim Hale and Albion, who we use for supplying some of our data, and indeed most of the firms that I rate in the UK who do financial planning well also use them. So it's not just us. And they actually do this donkey work in looking at this stuff in the background, and they produce very good documentation about it. If you think it's kind of, this is not my core skill, and it's not ours, then I think it's definitely worth
find somebody,
buying it in from somewhere where it is their core skill. It gives you it certainly, I think, gives you a sounder base for these things. So very, very worthwhile in our view.
The knock-on effect is for everybody out there using proprietary software, cash flow software, whether it's Voyant or Truth or Cash Calc or one of the many others that are available now, and more being developed in the background, I'm sure, that you don't just use the ones that are built in to the systems that they come with.
You can do.
But surely you have to think through whether your assumptions that you're going to use, what the background assumptions, how they were calculated, all of those aspects.
Well, this is, once again, this is why I say it's the process that you use to get to the number that's more important than the number. Because using the number that Truth or Voyant or DC or whoever came up with is one thing, but I think it's important to distinguish between I'm using the number that they put in as a default because they put it in as a default, compared to I'm using the number that they put in as a default because it just happened to be the same number that we came up with when we followed our process.
Yeah.
And I think it's similar to I think they still do it. The FCA used to produce, and the FSA used to produce every few years. They've got PwC or somebody to do a paper on assumptions, because they use them in their projection rates, the statutory projection rates. You can download this from their website, and it's got the conclusions that PwC came up with for what these various assumptions should be, and then the FCA decides, how to adjust its projection rates accordingly. And I always recommended reading this paper to people when I was doing training, because I said, it's not because the regulator uses these assumptions, you should use them too, because they're obviously going to mean that you're, quote, correct. But the interesting part of it is the rationale behind the numbers that they came up with.
Yeah.
What data they used to get to that point. Because you can apply that data, you can apply that process too. And if because we don't really get trained in certainly any of the exams that I've taken, there was nothing in there about how to come up with assumptions. And what data to look at and how to manipulate it and all that kind of stuff. So you kind of need some guidelines, I think, for how to do it. And I found these documents quite helpful in terms of giving you an idea of how you could go about it. And if it may be that you disagreed, it may be that you said, for example, well, I'm going to use for inflation, I'm going to use the Bank of England's target, because the Bank of England has been tasked with keeping inflation to that figure in the long term.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that every year inflation's going to be 2.5%, but it over 20 or 30 years, that's what they're aiming for. So you can say, well, okay, we think they'll hit that, or we think they won't hit that, but it gives you a starting point. And as these papers written for the regulator give you a starting point, and some sort of process that you can that you can attach your own methodology to, and that seems to me a lot safer than saying, well, because our software provider, and software providers are obviously, it's software, so the people working there will be basically software people. They don't have to be economists, and economists aren't always correct. I'm much more comfortable trusting their ability to write software which processes the numbers that I load into it correctly than I am in their ability to come up with what those numbers should be.
Yes, and the basis on what those numbers should be.
Yeah. And if I'm willing to assume that by and large they will process the variables that go into it correctly, because that's just a technical task. It's important that it's correct, but it's kind of easier than coming up with the number I guess it's quite easy to come up with a number. Maybe it's easier to do than there's less risk involved in doing that. The risk is you get it wrong, but it's either right or it's wrong. It either does what it's supposed to do or it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. With an assumption, you can have a good process and have a bad outcome, or you can have a good process and have a good outcome. But if you have a bad process, the chances of a bad outcome are much higher.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for joining me. And what I thought was going to be a quick natter about assumptions has turned into a slightly longer natter about assumptions and the impact of them, but really valuable insights there for any financial planners and people, looking to develop their own pieces of software, and also discussions with clients as well. So it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thanks very much for taking the time.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on.
I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. It's really interesting, isn't it, to listen to other people's points of view about different things, all relating to our wonderful financial planning profession. If you know anyone who might be interested in listening to any of these podcasts, please pass on our details to them. So that's it from me. Join me again next time when we'll be talking all things certified financial planner related, and also dropping in on our new entrants to the financial planning profession. Bye for now.